The gas lamps burned low. A cold yellow fog pressed against the windows of a narrow London house on Crawford Street. Upstairs, in a quiet room above the parlour, Mrs. Sarah Carnell lay tucked beneath a heavy quilt. She'd been ill for many weeks. A nurse sat close beside the bed. The nurse was gentle. The nurse was patient. The nurse held a small glass cup in a steady hand. The fire crackled softly in the grate. The mantel clock kept its slow, steady beat. From the street below came the clop of hooves on wet stone, and the far cry of a paper seller calling out the evening news. Mrs. Carnell's husband was downstairs, minding the shop. The bedroom smelled of coal smoke, lavender water, and beef broth gone cold. The nurse leaned forward and smiled. "Drink it down, love," she said softly. "It will warm you." Mrs. Carnell took the glass. She lifted it to her cracked lips. She took a small sip. Then she gasped and jerked away. Her mouth burned like fire. She spat the liquid out upon the bedding. The cloth hissed. A dark hole opened where the drink had fallen. The nurse did not move. Outside, a church bell began to ring. Chapter 1. The Quiet Sick Room. Good evening and welcome. This is the Bedside Historian, where old and shadowed stories are told in quiet rooms, for quiet minds, at the close of the long day. Wherever the listener tunes in from tonight, know that a welcome waits here. Perhaps the listener is far away in some cold country with snow heavy upon the rooftops. Perhaps the listener is in a warm room somewhere, the window open to a soft summer wind. Perhaps the hour is late. Perhaps it is near to midnight. Perhaps the clock upon the wall has just struck 3, and sleep still will not come. Take a moment, then, to settle down. Pull the covers up to the chin. Let the lamp burn low. If the thought occurs, leave a gentle comment beneath this video. Say where the listening is done and what the hour is there. Such small words help the channel grow. And if the listener has not yet joined us, the small red button waits nearby, patient as a candle on a shelf. A subscription costs nothing. A like, a share, a kind word, all help these old tales to find other listeners, in other quiet rooms, in other sleepless hours of the long night. And now let the world grow still. Let the clock slow down. Let the years peel back, soft as pages in an old book, until the gas lamps burn once more. London, in the middle years of the old Queen's reign, was a city of smoke and stone. The fog came down in winter, so thick that a man could lose his own hand within it. The streets smelled of coal soot, of horse sweat, of drains, and of the great brown river that curled through the heart of it all. The bells of 100 churches rang out the quarter hours. The cabs rattled over the wet cobbles. The lamplighters went about at dusk with their long poles and their small flames, touching each gas jet to life, until the pavements glowed pale yellow in the murk. Inside the houses the light was softer. It was yellow, like old butter. The rooms were narrow and tall. The walls were papered in deep greens, in dark reds, in heavy browns. The curtains were of velvet or of thick wool. The floors were covered with Turkey carpets, or with long runners of patterned cloth. Every surface wore a fringe. Every corner held a small table. Every table held a small thing. A china dog. A pair of candlesticks. A framed picture of some dead child. A lock of hair pressed under glass. The home of such an age was a cluttered place. It was also a sealed place. The windows were often shut against the night airs, which were thought to carry sickness. The doors were heavy. The chimneys drew up the smoke of the coal fires. The gas jets hissed their soft note on the walls. A house, in those years, was a private world. What happened within its walls was known chiefly to those who dwelled there, and to the servants who kept the grates, and to the doctors and nurses who were called in when the fever came to the door. Sickness was never far off. Cholera came up the river every few summers, and took the poor out of the slums in great numbers. Typhus came with the cold months. Scarlet fever moved through the nurseries of the rich and the poor alike. Gastric fever was so common a name that few thought to question it. Consumption, which the age called the White Plague, stole away young wives and quiet uncles at a steady pace. When a child was born, it was common for half of such children to never see their 10th year. Every family had its small graves. Every churchyard held a row of tiny stones, green with moss, the names upon them half worn away by the slow English rain. Into such a world, the bedside nurse was welcomed as a quiet angel. In an age when the great hospitals were still feared as places where the poor went to die, most nursing was done at home. A middle-class family or an old widow with means would send out word that a nurse was needed. A letter would come back. A woman would arrive at the door with a small carpet bag. Within that bag she would carry her apron, her clean linen cap, a box of simple medicines, perhaps a small prayer book, a pair of spectacles, a hairbrush, and a thimble. She would set down the bag. She would wash her hands. She would climb the narrow stairs, and from that hour she would belong to the house. She would sit at the bedside through the long hours. She would keep the fire fed with lumps of coal. She would damp the sick brow with a cloth wrung in cold water. She would measure out spoonfuls of the dark physic the doctor had left behind. She would read aloud from the prayer book when the patient asked for comfort. She would sing softly when the patient could not sleep. She would listen to secrets murmured in the fever, and she would keep those secrets close. She would, if the hour came, close the dead eyes with the pads of her fingers and lay the coins of the Queen upon the lids. She would wash the body. She would straighten the limbs. She would tie the jaw shut with a strip of cloth against the ghastly drop of death. Such women were trusted without question. They had to be. There was no other way. The newer idea of a trained nurse, taught in a proper school, licensed by a board, marked upon a register, was only just beginning to take shape in those years. Miss Nightingale had returned from the Crimea not many years before, and her methods were still new. Her little book, Notes on Nursing, was passed from hand to hand among the respectable, but it had not yet reached every household. Many nurses had learned the trade only by watching another nurse at work. Some had learned it by nursing their own dying kin. A few had read books. A great many had not. A woman could, in those years, simply call herself a nurse. No certificate was asked. No letter was required. A pleasant face, a quiet voice, a clean white apron, and a steady hand upon the teacup were the only proof the public asked. If she came recommended by a neighbour, or by the local clergyman, or by the doctor in the next street, that was reference enough. She would be shown to the sick room. She would be handed the keys. She would be told where the linen was kept, and where the tea caddy stood, and where the little brown bottles waited upon the shelf behind the washstand. The family would go about their lives. The husband would return to his shop. The grown daughters would go to their piano. The servants would go below stairs to the kitchen, and the nurse would sit alone with the patient, hour after hour, through the long, slow afternoons, and into the longer, slower nights. Most such women were kind. Most were honest. Most wept when the patient died, and took their small pay with humble thanks, and went on their way to the next house where sickness called them. Many devoted whole lives to this quiet labour. They saw the hidden griefs of the rich. They saw the hidden kindnesses of the poor. They closed the eyes of hundreds of strangers. They carried more secrets to their own graves than any priest. But now and again, not often, a different kind of woman came to the door. She arrived with the same small carpet bag. She wore the same clean white apron. She washed her hands in the same basin. She climbed the same narrow stairs. She took her seat beside the bed. She spoke in the same gentle voice. She gave the same soft smile. To every outward eye she was only another nurse come to do another honest job in another quiet house. But beneath the clean cap she was thinking of other things. She was thinking of the will that lay folded in the drawer of the bureau. She was thinking of the insurance book kept in the locked box beneath the bed. She was thinking of the silver spoons upon the sideboard, and the small store of gold sovereigns hidden inside the family Bible on the mantel. She was thinking of the little brown bottles upon the apothecary's shelf, and of what could be poured from them, slowly, patiently, a drop at a time, across the long weeks of her employment. Such women were rare, but such women did come, and when they came, the house they entered became a house of slow dying. The patient grew worse. The doctor was puzzled. The family was grieved. The nurse was gentle. The nurse was kind. The nurse was tireless. And at last, when the end came, the nurse was the chief mourner at the funeral, and the chief witness to the making of the last will, and the chief heir named in that will, when at length it was read aloud in the parlour by the family lawyer after the burial was done. The parlour was the heart of the Victorian house. It was the room at the front, near the street, kept for the best use. The piano stood there. The best chairs stood there. The family Bible lay upon a small round table. The photographs of the dead stood in their silver frames upon the mantel. A glass dome covered a stuffed bird, or a wax flower, or a mourning wreath woven from a lock of a dead child's hair. The clock upon the mantel was wound every Sunday morning with a small brass key. The curtains were drawn against the sun to save the wallpaper from fading. Visitors were received in the parlour. Tea was poured in the parlour. Marriages were proposed in the parlour. Wills were read in the parlour. And, when a fresh death had come to the house, the coffin was laid in the parlour, upon trestles, with the lid open and the candles lit at head and foot, so that neighbours and kin might come to look upon the face of the departed one last time, before the lid was screwed down. In such rooms, amid such furnishings, amid such customs, the nurse who came with poison in her carpet-bag did her quiet work. She did not need a knife. She did not need a rope. She did not need to lift a hand in any way that might be seen. She needed only time and trust and a steady pour from a small bottle into a steaming cup. The poisons of the age were many, and they were easily got. Arsenic was sold by every grocer in the land. It was sold to kill the rats in the cellar, and the flies on the shelf, and the mice behind the wainscot. It was mixed into paints and wallpapers and children's toys. It was stirred into the arsenical wafers that ladies swallowed to keep their skin a proper pale. It was white, like sugar. It had little taste and less smell. Culticum, drawn from the meadow saffron, was kept in brown bottles upon the shelves of every apothecary, to be given by drops for the pain of gout. Laudanum, which was opium dissolved in spirit, was drunk by tired mothers and by teething infants alike, and stood in almost every kitchen cupboard. Prussic acid, oil of vitriol, antimony, strychnine, belladonna, all of them could be bought if one only knew where to ask and what sum to lay down upon the counter and what soft excuse to give to the man behind it. No law of weight prevented such purchases. No register was kept. A woman might walk into a chemist's shop in any town in England and come out again with enough arsenic in her basket to kill a whole street. She might return the next week for a little more. No one asked her name. No one recorded her face. She walked back out into the gaslit fog, and the shop bell tinkled behind her, and the chemist went on measuring out powders at his counter, humming some quiet tune, and thought nothing at all of the small brown packet she had carried away with her. In the parlour of the house where she worked, she set her basket down. She hung her shawl upon the peg. She tied on her clean white apron. She climbed the stairs once more to the sick room. She picked up the spoon. She measured out the physic from the brown bottle. She added, perhaps, a single drop from another small bottle, a drop that the doctor had not left, a drop that no eye in the house had seen her pour. She stirred the spoon. She raised it to her patient's lips. She smiled. "Drink it down, love," she might say. "It will warm you." And the sick woman, or the old man, or the thin small child, would obey, because she was the nurse. And nurses were to be trusted. And no one in all of England, in all those long gaslit years, had yet been taught to ask why so many of the sick seemed to die, slowly and quietly, in the soft presence of such kind women, with such clean white aprons, and such steady hands upon the teacup. Somewhere in that sealed world, in a small fen town in Lincolnshire, a girl named Catherine was growing up by the side of a slow brown river. Somewhere far to the north, in the coal country of Durham, a girl named Mary Ann was coming into the world in a pit cottage of blackened stone. Neither of them knew the other. Neither of them would ever meet. But both of them, in their own time, would learn the quiet trade of the bedside nurse. And both of them, in their own time, would learn a second trade, darker than the first. Their names would one day ring through the courts at the Old Bailey and at Durham. Their faces would one day hang upon the walls of every police office in the kingdom. Their stories would one day fill the pages of every newspaper in the land, and crowds of 20,000 souls would stand in the cold to watch them die. But all of that lay far off, in years yet unwritten. In the meantime, the fog pressed upon the windows. The gas lamps hissed their soft note. The kettle sang upon the hob. And in the quiet parlours of England, the trusted nurse set out the tea things, one by one, upon the small round table, and waited for the hour of her work to come. Chapter 2. The apothecary's shelf before the two nurses are brought forward. It is well to stand a while in the little shop where their tools were sold. Every English town of any size in those years had its apothecary. In a village he might share a shop front with the grocer. In a market town he would keep his own small place, with a bow window upon the high street and his name in gold letters above the door. In London there were hundreds of such shops, tucked between the tailors and the tobacconists, their windows full of coloured glass globes in blue, in green, in rich red. By night the gas jet behind the globes glowed softly through the coloured liquid and threw pools of strange, jewelled light upon the wet paving stones outside. A bell rang when the door was opened. The air within smelled of many things at once. It smelled of dried herbs hung in bundles from the rafters. It smelled of beeswax, and of camphor, and of peppermint, and of the sharp oil of bitter almonds. It smelled of the sulphur in brown paper packets. It smelled of the iron of the tinctures. It smelled, faintly, of the death that sat behind the counter in small brown bottles waiting for its turn. The counter ran the length of the room. It was of dark polished wood. Behind it stood the apothecary in his long white apron, with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a pair of small steel spectacles upon his nose. Behind him rose the great ranks of drawers and shelves that every such shop possessed. The drawers were small and square, each with a brass handle, each labelled in neat black letters upon a white porcelain plaque. The shelves above held the bottles. There were hundreds of them. They were of coloured glass, green and blue and brown. Each bore its own label. Many of those labels were written in Latin, in the slanted hand of the old trade. Tinctura opii, liquora arsenicalis, vinum cocci, acidum sulphuricum, spiritus ammonia, pulvis ipecacuame. A customer would come in and state a need. A poultice for an old man's chest, a lotion for a child's rash, a powder for the sore head that followed a night of too much port. The apothecary would listen, nod, and turn to his shelves. He would open a drawer. He would weigh out a small amount of powder upon a brass scale. He would tip the powder onto a little square of white paper. He would fold the paper into a neat small packet with 3 sharp creases and seal it with a drop of red wax. He would take down a bottle, uncork it, and tip a careful measure into a smaller bottle. He would wipe the neck with a cloth, drive in a fresh cork, and stick a narrow white label upon the side. He would write upon the label in copperplate hand. He would hand over the packet or the bottle. The customer would hand over the coins. The bell would ring again as the door opened. The customer would be gone. No register was kept. No name was taken. No signature was asked. Arsenic stood at the front of the stage of such shops. It was, in those years, the quiet friend of every English household. Farmers bought it by the pound to dress their seed corn, to kill the rats that lived in the stackyard, to poison the foxes that came after the lambs. Housewives bought it by the ounce, to kill the bedbugs that lived in the cracks of the bedstead, to rid the kitchen of mice, to wash down the drains against the smell. Young ladies bought it by the grain, pressed into little wafers, to swallow with their morning tea, believing that it made their skin whiter and their eyes brighter. It was cheap. It was plentiful. It was white and powdery, and looked very like ordinary household sugar or baking flour. The dose that would kill a grown man was small. 2 grains, perhaps 3, mixed into a cup of hot tea, was enough to make him very ill in a few hours. 5 grains would carry him off before the night was done. The signs of such poisoning were the signs of many common sicknesses of the age. There was vomiting. There was looseness of the bowels. There was pain in the stomach, sharp and twisting. There was thirst, a great burning thirst. There was cramp in the legs. There was cold sweat upon the brow. At the end there was weakness and collapse, and a small rattle in the throat. The doctor, when he was called, would listen to the symptoms. He would feel the pulse. He would press upon the stomach. He would ask what the patient had eaten. He would hear that the patient had eaten only a little broth, and a little bread, and some tea. He would nod. He would say the name of a disease. He would say gastric fever. He would say English cholera. He would say a stomach complaint. He would write out a prescription. He would take his fee. He would leave the house. He would not ask to see the tea-caddy. Culticum was a quieter poison, and a rarer one, but just as deadly. It was drawn from the root and the seed of the meadow saffron, a pretty lilac flower that grew in the damp meadows of late summer. In small, careful drops, it was given by doctors to ease the pain of gout. Gout was a common affliction among the well-fed gentlemen of the age, and so a bottle of the tincture of culticum was kept in many a sick room, where an old uncle or a stout merchant lay groaning with his foot swollen upon a cushion. In large doses, the tincture brought on a long, slow misery. It burned the mouth. It brought up the contents of the stomach, again and again, until there was nothing left to bring up but bile and blood. The pulse grew thin. The skin grew cold. The patient lay through days of slow agony, calling for water, and died at last of simple weakness. Because coacum did not stay long in the body after death, it was very hard to find, even for those who knew to look. Sulphuric acid, which the age more often called oil of vitriol, was sold freely for the cleaning of drains and the polishing of brass. It was sold in brown bottles, stoppered with great care. It burned whatever it touched. A single drop upon a white handkerchief would eat a hole through the cloth in a moment. A mouthful would burn away the lining of the throat. Laudanum, the dark red drink of opium dissolved in spirit, was poured down the throats of crying babies to still them in the cradle, and drunk by weary women to ease the long pains of their monthly suffering, and sipped by poets and scholars who could not sleep for the fever of their thoughts. A small excess could carry a man into a sleep from which no bell could wake him. All of this was known. All of this was sold. All of this was kept upon the open shelves of every town in the kingdom. The young chemist's apprentice, some lad of 14 or 15, new up from his father's village, might serve the customer while the master was at his dinner. He might hand over a packet of white powder without a question asked. If later, when the summons came, he could not remember the face of the woman to whom he had sold it, that too would be no surprise. The shop was busy. Many faces passed across the counter in the course of a long day. One more woman in a dark cloak, with a soft voice, and a small coin laid down beside her record list, would be forgotten before the bell upon the door had finished ringing. Such was the world into which Catherine Wilson and Mary Ann Cotton came. Such was the shelf from which their quiet trade would draw its wares. The law, in those years, had not yet caught up to the chemist's shop. It would do so at last, but only after many small coffins had been carried out of many quiet doors. In the meantime, the brown bottles stood silent in their rows. The drawers with their neat brass handles slept in their wooden frames. The bell above the shop door rang its small bright note, again and again, through the long gas-lit afternoons, and the small white packets tied with string went out into the streets of England in the baskets of honest cooks, of busy housewives, of tired servants, and, now and again, of quiet women with soft voices and clean white aprons folded neatly at the bottom of their bags. Chapter 3. The Girl from Lincolnshire. The story of Catherine Wilson begins in the flat country of the English fens, where the sky is wider than the land, and the wind comes off the North Sea unchecked by any hill. She was born, so the old parish books suggest, in the year 1822. The place of her birth was the small village of Surfleet, or perhaps the neighbouring parish, a few miles north of the market town of Spalding, in the county of Lincolnshire. Lincolnshire, in those years, was a county of long straight dykes and slow brown rivers, of great sweeps of rich black earth won back from the marshes, of little villages huddled round their grey stone churches, of cabbages and potatoes and tulip bulbs, of wind pumps turning slowly against the low grey sky. Her father was a carpenter. He worked with saw and chisel and plane, in a small open shed behind the cottage, with the shavings curling to his boots and the smell of fresh pine in the air. Her mother, of whom less is known, kept the small cottage, cooked upon the open hearth, drew water from the well, and bore the children who came one after another into that hard, cold life. There were, it is said, other children besides Catherine. She grew up among brothers and sisters, in a cottage of 2 small rooms with a loft above where the children slept upon straw mattresses beneath the low bare beams. She learned, as every child of her class and country learned in those years, to make herself useful early. She fetched water from the pump. She gathered sticks for the fire. She scrubbed the flagstones of the floor with sand and a hard brush. She helped her mother to salt the pork against the winter. She helped to pick the beans in the small garden behind the cottage. She went to the parish school when the weather allowed, and when she was not needed at home, and learned there the letters of the alphabet, the catechism of the Church of England, a little plain sewing, and a great deal of quiet obedience. She was, by all accounts, a clever child. She had a quick ear for the speech of others. She had a memory that held what it heard. She had a soft voice and a gentle way of standing, and a small pale face beneath her plain brown hair which struck those who saw her as almost pretty. The fens in those years were a place of hard living. Work was long. Food was plain. Illness was frequent. The Low Country, with its standing water and its slow damp air, bred agues and fevers in plenty. Children died often in such villages. Old people went quietly. In a day or two, when the winter came too hard, the parish church stood in the middle of such places, with its tower of grey Lincolnshire stone and its yard full of crooked leaning stones, each one telling a small tale of departure. Every family knew the shape of grief. Every child had seen a coffin carried out of a neighbour's door. What exactly went wrong between the girl Catherine and her family is not easy to say. The later newspapers, when they came to tell her story, spoke of early troubles. They said that she had been caught, when very young, in some small theft, perhaps of money, perhaps of goods, from within her father's house. They said that she confessed to the theft, and that there was anger and tears and some sharp punishment. They said that her father, who had been a respectable man in his small way, fell on hard times himself in those years, and ended at last as an inmate of one of the old beat-houses of the town, which were small almshouses kept by the charity of past centuries for the relief of the poor and the aged. Of her mother nothing more was heard. By the time Catherine was a grown woman, both parents were said to be dead. She left home young. She went first, it would seem, to the town of Spalding. Spalding was the market centre of the district, a place of bulb fields and tulip growers, of corn merchants and wool warehouses, of narrow streets winding down to the slow green river. There she found the first kind of work that a poor girl of her sort could find. She went into service. She worked, perhaps, as a housemaid in a respectable household, scrubbing steps in the early morning, lighting the fires, carrying coal, emptying slop pails, sleeping in a small room at the top of the house, rising again before dawn to begin once more. It was in Spalding, or in Boston, the larger port town a little further south along the River Witham, that she first took up the trade of nurse. The manner in which she came to it is not set down. Perhaps she had helped to nurse a dying mistress in service, and had shown a quiet hand and a steady temper, and had been recommended to another household when the death was done. Perhaps she had nursed some neighbour in the lodging-house where she kept her own room, and had been paid a few shillings for her pains. Perhaps she had simply seen, as many a clever girl saw, that a nurse was better paid than a housemaid, and her hours in some ways her own, and had set about making herself one. She was a young woman now. The girl of the fens had grown into a small, neat figure, with pale skin, grey eyes, and a soft, quiet voice. She tied her hair back plainly under a white cap. She wore a dark gown and a long white apron. She learned to sit still at a bedside. She learned to speak little and to listen much. She learned the smell of a sick room and the signs of its turning. She learned the spoonfuls of the physics upon the shelf. She learned to close a door softly, and to carry a tray without rattling, and to move about a sleeping room without waking the one who slept within it. She also learned, so it was afterwards said, to listen at keyholes. She learned who kept their money in which drawer, and who stored their silver in which cupboard, and who had sons gone to sea who might never return to claim their share. She learned the names of lawyers. She learned the look of a will in an envelope. She learned the small box beside the bed where the old people hid their precious things. She was always helpful. She was always kind. She was always ready with a smile. But behind the grey eyes, something else was at work. Somewhere in those years, she married. The man's name was Dixon. Of the wedding, little is recorded. Perhaps it was a quiet service in some Lincolnshire church with 2 witnesses only, on a rainy morning. He was a drinker. He lived, for a time, by her side. But he does not seem to have lived long. He died, quite young, in the town of Boston, with very little explanation, and with no great sorrow on her part. A bottle of Colchimate was afterward remembered, had stood upon the shelf in his room. The doctor had thought of an autopsy. She had begged him, with tears in her eyes, not to disturb the dead man's rest. The doctor, a kind country practitioner with other calls to make, had nodded, and signed the paper, and gone away. The body had been carried out of the small house, and laid in the churchyard, and the earth closed over it, and the rain began to fall upon the fresh-turned soil. Catherine Wilson, now a young widow, had taken down the small black bonnet that widows wore, and tied its ribbons beneath her chin, and set out once more into the world. She had learned by this time a very important thing. She had learned that in a small town, in a small house, with a quiet patient and a busy doctor, a person could die, and the earth could close above them, and no one would ever ask the real question. She had learned that the trust of the English home was almost perfect. She had learned that a nurse, once admitted, was never suspected. She had learned, above all, the precise number of drops that would turn a kindness into a killing. With this knowledge folded away inside her, she walked on down the dusty road. She walked, with her small carpet bag and her clean apron and her soft voice, toward the next house that would open to her, toward an old sea captain in the port of Boston, whose foot ached with gout and whose will lay unwritten upon the table beside his bed. Chapter 4. The Captain's Last. Well, the town of Boston stood a little way south of Spalding, where the River Witham opened at last into the grey mouth of the Wash. It was, in those years, a small port, filled with the masts of fishing smacks and trading brigs, and with the low warehouses of the corn merchants, and with the tall brick tower of the great parish church whose lantern had guided ships for 5 centuries. The streets smelled of tar and rope and salt fish. The gulls wheeled above the red-tiled roofs. The tide came up the river twice each day and turned the ships at their moorings. Captain Peter Maurer lived in a small house not far from the quayside. He had spent his younger years at sea in the coastal trade, carrying coal and grain and timber along the eastern shore of England. He had saved a little money year by year and had at last bought his own small vessel, and had worked her for a time and had sold her again when age came upon him. He was, by the early years of the 1850s, an old man. His hair was white and thin. His hands were spotted and stiff. He walked with a stick. He suffered, as so many men of his age and habits suffered, from gout. His foot swelled. His great toe burned. On the bad nights he could not sleep for the throbbing of it. He kept, upon the small table beside his bed, a brown bottle of the tincture of colchicum, which the local doctor had given him. He measured out the drops with a small silver spoon. The drops eased his pain and let him sleep. He lived alone in the small brick house by the quay. He had no wife. He had no children. He had a brother named John, who lived at some distance, and who had long expected to be remembered in the captain's will. The captain had written such a will some years back, and had left the greater part of his small estate to this brother. The will lay folded in a tin box beneath the bed. But the captain was lonely in his old age. His foot hurt him. The stairs were hard to climb. The fire in the grate went out when he dozed, and there was no one to build it up again. The house grew cold. The hours grew long. The neighbours said it was a pity, and that the old captain ought to have someone to do for him. The neighbours said, in the low voice of small towns, that there was a young widow in the place, a Mrs. Dixon, a nurse by trade, who was looking for a position, and who was said to be gentle with old people. So Catherine Wilson, for that was the name by which she still went, or else Mrs. Dixon as some called her, came to the small brick house by the quay. She came with her carpet bag. She wore her dark gown and her clean apron and her small white cap. She knocked at the door. She was shown in. She sat with the old captain in his kitchen and drank a cup of tea with him. She listened while he spoke of his years at sea, of ports he had known in Holland, of storms off the Dogger Bank, of a brother whom he had not seen for many a year. She smiled. She nodded. She asked gentle questions. By the end of the afternoon, the captain had decided that she would do very well. She would come in the mornings. She would cook his dinner. She would tidy his rooms. She would help him up the stairs at night. She would measure out the drops of colchicum for his foot. She moved her small belongings into the small back room of the house. She tied on her apron. She began her work. She was quick. She was quiet. She was good-tempered. She never complained. She listened to the captain's long tales of the sea with a patience that he had not known since his own mother was alive. She brought him his meals on a small tray. She set the tray upon his knees. She sat upon the stool beside his chair while he ate. She took the tray away again when he was done. She washed the dishes in the stone sink. She swept the kitchen with a besom of birch twigs. She built up the fire. She drew the curtains at dusk. She lit the oil lamp upon the table. She read to him from his old prayer book when he asked her to. She poured his evening nit of rum and water. She helped him up the stairs. She measured out his drops of colchicum upon the small silver spoon. She helped him into bed. She turned down the wick of the lamp. She closed the door softly behind her. In the quiet of such days she spoke with him of other matters. She spoke of the uncertainty of life. She spoke of the sorrow of a man who had no proper heir near him. She spoke, perhaps with a small tear in her eye, of her own late husband, Mr. Dixon, who had been taken from her so young. She spoke of her small means, of her hard struggles, of her hope to one day keep a respectable lodging house of her own and to end her days in quiet comfort. The captain listened. The captain nodded. The captain was moved. In the early part of the year 1854, the captain sent for a man of law. The man of law came with his small leather case and his bundle of papers and his black silk hat. He sat at the table in the captain's parlour. He drew up a new will, according to the captain's wishes. The old will, which had left all to the brother John, was set aside. The new will left to Catherine, under the name by which she was then known, the sum of £50 a year for her life, to be paid out of the captain's savings, with smaller legacies to certain other persons. The captain signed his name with a shaking hand. 2 neighbours came in as witnesses and signed their names below his. The man of law folded the paper, sealed it with red wax, placed it in his leather case, tipped his black hat, and took his leave. The captain lived for some weeks after that. He was still able to sit up and to take his tea, and to speak of the ships that had once lain at the quay, but his gout grew worse. His nights grew harder. The drops of colchicum no longer brought the old relief. Sometimes, after taking his medicine, he was sick into the basin by the bed. Sometimes his legs cramped in the dark, and he called out for her, and she came at once in her nightgown and shawl, the small candle in her hand, her grey eyes soft with pity. She smoothed the pillow. She wiped the sweat from his brow with a clean cloth dipped in cool water. She held his hand. She told him that all would be well. She gave him, perhaps, one more small measured spoonful from the brown bottle. In October of 1854, the old captain died. The death was sudden at the last, after a few hours of sharp suffering, and yet in another sense it was not sudden at all, for he had been sinking steadily for weeks. The local doctor was called. He came. He looked at the body. He listened to the nurse, who wept quietly into her apron. He nodded. He spoke the word coroner. He wrote the certificate. He took his small fee. He touched his hat to her. He went away. The captain was buried in the churchyard of Boston, under a small grey stone. The brother John came down from his distant place. He was, it is said, surprised to hear of the new will. He was, it is said, deeply aggrieved. But there was the paper, signed and sealed, and witnessed by 2 neighbours, and there was little that the brother John could do except to stand by the grave in his black suit and watch the earth fall upon his brother's coffin, and go home again, poorer than he had come. Catherine Wilson, in her widow's black, took up her small inheritance of £50 a year, packed her carpet-bag, and left the small brick house by the quay. She did not stay in Boston. The wind upon the Wash was cold at that season, and the neighbours had begun to speak a little, in that low voice which small towns used when they were not quite ready to speak loud. She turned her face southward, down the long road toward London. The smoke and fog of the great city waited there, and the tall lodging-houses of Bloomsbury, and a widowed landlady named Maria Soames, who kept her rooms near Russell Square, and who would, before long, take a young nurse into her house, and offer her a cup of tea, and show her to a small bedroom at the top of the stairs. Chapter 5. The lodging-house in Bloomsbury, London, in the middle of the 1850s, drew the poor and the ambitious and the lost toward its smoking chimneys as a great fire draws moss in from the dark of a summer field. Catherine Wilson came to the city among them. She stepped down from the carrier's van at one of the northern inns, with her carpet-bag in her hand and her small inheritance in a purse stitched inside her gown. She took a hackney cab, perhaps, across the rattling cobbles to the quiet streets of Bloomsbury, where the tall brick houses stood in their neat long rows, and the squares lay behind their iron railings, and the plane trees put out their wide green leaves against the yellow fog. She did not come alone. She had found herself, in those years, a companion. His name was James Dixon. Whether he was any true kin to the dead Mr. Dixon of Boston, or whether he was simply another man of the same common name who had drifted into her life, is no longer certain. He was not her lawful husband, though in the small world of lodgings and landladies she spoke of him as such. He was a man of no great account. He drank. He drifted. He took work when work be had. He was, in the phrase of the age, a heavy drinker. She had her small income of £50 a year from the dead captain. He had very little. Together they found lodgings in the house of a widow named Maria Soames. Mrs. Soames kept a respectable house in Alfred Street, which ran close to the older courts of Bloomsbury. She had lately been left a widow. Her husband had died not long before. She was a quiet woman in her middle years, round-faced, kind, a little lonely, perhaps a little frightened of the empty rooms above her. She let out her first-floor apartments to lodgers of good character, and she lived below with her children. Into this house, in the year 1855, came Mrs. Wilson and her Mr. Dixon. They took the rooms above. They paid their rent. They settled in. Catherine Wilson was very good to Mrs. Soames. She was attentive in small ways. She brought down a little jug of cream when she knew the landlady had been out in the rain. She helped with the children when the nursemaid was ill. She sat with Mrs. Soames in the parlour of an evening and listened to her small troubles and spoke of her own. She grew to be, within a few months, more than a lodger. She was a friend. Mrs. Soames began to rely upon her. Mrs. Soames began to confide in her. There were quiet tears shed between the two women over their shared cups of tea. There were confidences about money. There was a certain gentleman, Mrs. Soames once whispered, who had been paying her attentions, and who had borrowed a little sum from her on a pledge of marriage, and who had then gone silent, and who she very much hoped would come back soon with the money and the promise. In the first part of that year, James Dixon fell ill. He had been unwell, in a broken sort of way, for some time. He took to his bed in the first-floor room. Catherine, as was fit and proper, nursed him. She brought him his broth. She bathed his forehead. She measured out whatever drops the doctor had sent. She was patient with him, though the neighbours agreed he had long tried her patience. He was, in the words of the age, a burden upon her. He grew worse. He was sick into the basin. His legs cramped. His pulse grew thin. In the month of June in the year 1856, James Dixon died. The doctor, a respectable man named Widbourne, was called. He wrote out the certificate. He gave the cause as natural disease. James Dixon was carried out of the lodging-house in a plain box. He was buried and forgotten with remarkable speed. Mrs. Wilson stayed on in the upstairs rooms, in her quiet widow's black, and Mrs. Soames downstairs was kinder than ever. In the autumn of that same year, Mrs. Soames herself began to feel unwell. It began with a small trouble of the stomach. She had taken, she said, a little too much supper the night before. She was sure it would pass. Mrs. Wilson came down the stairs at once, her apron on, her sleeves rolled back. She put Mrs. Soames to bed in her own room on the ground floor. She drew the curtains against the afternoon light. She filled a stone bottle with hot water and laid it at the landlady's feet. She sent the servant for the doctor. In the meantime, she prepared a soothing drink in the kitchen, of warm water and sugar, and some small addition which the kitchen girl did not quite see. She carried the cup upstairs on a tray and held it to Mrs. Soames's lips. "Drink it down," she said in her soft, quiet voice. "It will warm you." Mrs. Soames drank. Mrs. Soames grew worse. The doctor came. The doctor was puzzled. The vomiting would not stop. The pulse was weak. The limbs grew cold. He ordered this remedy, and then that one. Each was dutifully fetched. Each was dutifully administered by the steady hand of the nurse upstairs, who had come down now to live almost wholly in the sick-room. 2 days passed in this way. Then 3. Mrs. Soames could keep nothing down. She could barely speak above a whisper. Her children were brought in to see her. The younger ones cried and were led out. On the 5th day, quite gently, in the presence of her weeping nurse, Maria Soames stopped breathing. The doctor came once more. He shook his head. He wrote out the certificate. He gave the cause as natural disease of the stomach. The house was filled with the low talk of mourning. Catherine Wilson was tireless. She laid out the body with her own hands. She washed it. She combed its hair. She dressed it in a clean nightgown. She laid coins upon the eyes. She tied the jaw with a strip of linen. She lit the candles at the head and foot of the bed. She came and went to the door to admit the callers. She served the tea. She wiped the tears of the children. She wrote the letters to the distant kin. She spoke, to any who would listen, of the sudden sorrow, and of the strange last words, and of the certain rumour which she herself had begun to spread, very softly in the hearing of certain neighbours. The rumour was this: that poor Mrs. Soames, deceived in her hopes of marriage by a certain Mr. Taylor, who had borrowed her money and would not come back, had at the last taken her own life, by some small dose of something she had kept by her, that she had let the grief into her heart, and it had poisoned her from within. It was a useful story. It explained the sickness. It explained the letters. It explained, above all, the will. For when the lawyer came and the papers were brought out, and the small tin box was opened, it was found that Mrs. Soames had, in the last weeks of her life, altered her testament. A sum of money, not large, but not small, had been set aside to be paid to her kind and faithful lodger and friend, Mrs. Catherine Wilson, in recognition of her many services. A letter, too, was found, in what looked very much like Mrs. Soames's own hand, begging forgiveness for some dark act of her own. The letter was in truth not in Mrs. Soames's hand at all. It was in the hand of the nurse upstairs. But no one, in that grieving household, thought to match the two hands against each other. Catherine Wilson pocketed her money. She gathered her bag. She dressed once more in her clean apron. She left the house in Alfred Street, with its empty parlour and its small fatherless and motherless children. She walked out into the London fog. She took another set of rooms. She put up her name once more, quietly, in the way such names were put up among those who had need of a nurse. And Mr. Dixon, the drunken companion, who had also died in that house in the quiet of an earlier month. His name had already begun to fade from the minds of the landlady's children, and from the minds of the neighbours, and from the rolls of the parish. There was no brother to ask after him. There was no employer to miss him. He had slipped away into the great anonymous grave of London, as thousands of such men slipped away each year. Only one person in the world remembered very clearly the exact hour at which he had drawn his last breath, and the exact spoonful that had helped him on his way. That person was tying her apron now, in a new lodging, across the other side of the city, and humming very softly as she set the kettle on the hob. Chapter 6. The Nurse Travels North. The London years had taught Catherine Wilson much. They had taught her that the great city was a forest in which a single tree could not easily be marked. They had taught her that a name might be changed as easily as a bonnet, from Wilson to Taylor, from Taylor back to Wilson, from Mrs. Dixon to Mrs. Connell, as the need arose. They had taught her that a landlady's death could be explained away, and a lover's death written off, and a will altered, and a rumour spread, and no one in all the city would look close enough to see the careful hand behind it. But the city was a hungry place. The money of Mrs. Soames was soon eaten up. The £1 a week from the old captain was not enough to keep a woman in the style she had begun to expect. She needed fresh patients. She needed fresh houses. She needed, above all, fresh places where her old footprints were not yet printed in the mud. So she travelled. She went north, up the long coach road, back into the fen country she had come from. She went to Boston once more. She went to Kirkby Lonsdale, far up in the cold stone country of Westmoreland. She went to such towns as had one or two respectable widows of means living on their own, and not too many busy neighbours to ask too many busy questions. In the town of Boston there lived a young woman named Mrs. Jane Jackson. Her husband David was a millwright. His work often took him away from home for days and weeks together. In his absences Mrs. Jackson kept the house, and looked after the child, and counted out the small store of money that the husband had left behind in the drawer. She was respectable. She was quiet. She was perhaps a little dull in the long empty afternoons when her husband was far off at his mill. Into this quiet house one afternoon in the year 1859 came a woman with a soft voice and a small carpet bag. She gave her name as Mrs. Taylor. She was, she said, a nurse. She had heard from some common acquaintance that Mrs. Jackson was not in the best of health. She had called only to offer, as a friend of a friend, her small services. Mrs. Jackson, charmed by the quiet manner and the kind grey eyes, let her in. She poured out the tea. The two women sat together in the small parlour, while the clock upon the mantel ticked, and the rain fell upon the street outside. So it began. Mrs. Taylor, who was Catherine Wilson under another name, came often to the house. She brought small presents. She helped with the child. She sat with Mrs. Jackson through the long afternoons. She was, she said, a friend. She was, she said, almost like a sister. Mrs. Jackson trusted her. In a little while Mrs. Jackson took to her bed with a sharp sickness of the stomach. Mrs. Taylor nursed her. Mrs. Taylor made the drinks. Mrs. Taylor sat with her through the long nights. Mrs. Jackson died within a few days. It was found after the funeral was done that a sum of money, nearly £200, had been drawn from her husband's account at the bank, upon a paper that bore a signature very like his wife's. The money could not be traced. The quiet friend from somewhere else was gone from the town. The husband, David Jackson, coming home at last from his distant mill, stood in his own empty parlour with his hat in his hand, and could make no sense of it. Word, however, was beginning to travel. In small towns, wherever men and women meet at the market and at the church porch, words travel very well indeed. A nurse named Wilson, or Taylor, or Dixon, by various accounts, had been seen in Boston, and had been seen also in Kirkby Lonsdale. And in Kirkby Lonsdale, in the year 1860, there had died, most suddenly, a respectable dressmaker named Mrs. Anne Atkinson. Mrs. Atkinson lived in Kirkby Lonsdale with her husband Joseph, who was a tailor. She was a woman of small means, but of steady industry. She kept a little millinery shop, and employed one other woman and 3 apprentices. She was known and liked in the town. Once a year she travelled to London to buy her goods for the trade, to see the warehouses of the great wholesalers, and to renew her stock of ribbons and braids and plumes. She had nephews and nieces in London, and stayed with one of them when she went down. One of these nephews was called James Dixon. He had lived with a woman called Wilson, who had at last been known to all as his wife, though the marriage papers were never quite found. James Dixon had died in that house in Bloomsbury, and Catherine Wilson had spread the word among his family that he had died of galloping consumption. The uncle and aunt in Kirkby Lonsdale had believed her. They had felt sorry for the young widow. They had kept in touch with her. So in October of the year 1860, when Mrs. Anne Atkinson came down to London upon her yearly journey, she stayed, not at her usual lodgings, but at the house of her nephew's widow, Catherine Wilson, who now lodged somewhere quietly in the back streets of the city. She was welcomed in. She was given tea. She was given a soft bed. Within a few days, she was gravely ill. A telegram flew up the long new wires to Kirkby Lonsdale. Her husband Joseph came down to London in haste, heartsick, a folded travelling bag in his hand. He arrived the evening before she died. He sat beside her bed. She was too weak to say much. The next day, the 19th of October, Mrs. Anne Atkinson was dead. She was taken back to Kirkby Lonsdale in a coffin by railway and buried in the churchyard at the top of the town, under a grey stone with her name carved plainly upon it. Her husband went home to an empty shop. The kind widow in London wrote him a letter, not long after, to say that poor Mrs. Atkinson had borrowed a small sum from her, which he now regretfully required to be repaid. He paid it. He was too grieved to think. The story of poor Mrs. Atkinson stayed in Kirkby Lonsdale. It was told by the neighbours in the long evenings. It was told at the market. It was told at the porch of the old church. After her body was exhumed in the year 1862, as part of a larger inquiry, traces of suspicion hardened into open talk. The analyst at Leeds, a celebrated man of chemistry, tested what was left of her. The results were enough to trouble him. A woman had come into the town and had stayed only a short time, and had crossed the path of more than one family, and every family she had crossed had suffered a sudden death. The pattern, once it was looked for, was plain to see. That by the time the pattern was seen, the nurse herself had moved on once more. She had returned to London. She had taken new ruse. She was nursing, now, a new patient. Her name was Mrs. Sarah Carnell, of Crawford Street, near the New Road in the parish of Marylebone. Mrs. Carnell was 54 years old, and had means, and had been unwell for some time, and had lately altered her will in favour of her kind and faithful nurse. Outside the house in Crawford Street, the gas lamps hissed in the damp spring evening. The milkman rattled his cans down the pavement. A policeman in his high black hat passed slowly along the street, his lantern swinging in his hand. None of them yet had any reason to stop at the door with the brass number above the knocker. None of them yet knew that within that house, behind the drawn curtains of a first-floor bedroom, a small glass cup stood upon a nightstand, waiting to be lifted to a trusting pair of lips. None of them yet knew that the liquid in the cup was not physic at all. It was oil of vitriol. It was the strongest of the acids the old shop sold. It would, in the next hour, burn a hole in the bedding. It would, in the next hour, become the small slip that undid all the quiet years of Catherine Wilson's careful work. Chapter 7. The Draught on Crawford Street. The spring of the year 1862 came in with soft rains over London. The plane trees in the squares began to put out their pale new leaves. The daffodils came up in the gardens of the great houses in Regent's Park. The streets were still cold at dawn, and the fog still came up thick in the evenings. But the sky in the middle of the day was now more often grey-blue than yellow-brown. It was a pleasant season for the healthy. For the sick, as for the sick of every season, It was another long journey from one dark hour to the next. Mrs. Sarah Carnell lived with her husband in a small house in Crawford Street. The street lay not far from the new road, which the city had begun to call by a newer name, the Marylebone Road, for it ran along the northern edge of the parish of Marylebone. The house was a narrow brick house of 4 stories, with a front door of dark painted wood and a brass knocker, and a small area railed with black iron where the steps went down to the kitchen. The parlour was on the ground floor. The bedroom was on the first floor, above the parlour, with a window that looked out upon the street. Mr. Carnell kept a small trade downstairs. Mrs. Carnell kept the house when she was well. She had not been well for some time now. Her trouble was of the stomach and of the nerves. She lost her appetite. She was weak of a morning. The doctor came and wrote out his papers and sent his black bottles. In the winter that had just passed, Mrs. Carnell had taken on a nurse. The nurse had been recommended. The nurse was quiet and kind. She gave her name in that house as Mrs. Connell, or Mrs. Taylor, or Mrs. Wilson, as the occasion seemed to call for. She lived in the house. She slept in a small room upon the second floor. She came down to the sick room at all hours of the day and of the night. She measured out the medicines. She held the sick woman's hand. She bathed the sick woman's brow. She sat quietly in the corner with her knitting, her needles clicking softly in the firelight, while Mrs. Carnell dozed. By the spring of 1862, Mrs. Carnell had come to lean upon her nurse with great trust. They had spoken together of many things. They had spoken of Mrs. Carnell's fears that she might not long recover. They had spoken of Mr. Carnell, who was a good husband, but anxious in his trade, and who would not wish to be troubled in a time of sorrow. They had spoken of a certain small alteration to be made in the paper that lay folded in the bureau, by which a grateful patient might leave a small remembrance to the faithful nurse. The alteration was made. A gentleman of law came in one afternoon at the lady's request, and wrote a short paper, and had it signed and witnessed, and took away his fee. The nurse, standing quietly at the door, had seen the paper signed. The nurse had seen the paper sealed. The nurse had seen the gentleman of law slip the paper into his case and carry it away with him to his chambers. It was done. Within a day or two, Mrs. Carnell was found to be suffering more than she had been. Her pains were sharper. Her stomach was worse. The nurse was very concerned. She sent the servant out to the chemist's shop on a small errand with a little slip of paper in her pocket. The servant came back with a brown bottle, tightly stoppered, wrapped in a scrap of newsprint. The nurse took the bottle. She set it upon the little shelf behind her. She continued about her quiet work. That afternoon, in the first-floor bedroom above the parlour in Crawford Street, the gas jet hissed softly on the wall. The fire burned low in the grate. The clock on the mantel ticked its slow, steady beat. Mrs. Carnell lay propped upon 2 pillows, a shawl about her shoulders, her eyes half shut. The nurse came in with a small glass cup upon a saucer. She had mixed a draught in the kitchen, so she said. It would, she promised, soothe her mistress's stomach and let her sleep. She set the saucer down upon the little table by the bed. She took up the cup. She leaned forward. Drink it down, love, she said in her soft, quiet voice. It will warm you. Mrs. Carnell was drowsy. She opened her mouth. She took in a small sip. What happened next happened in less than the breath. A searing pain struck her lips and her tongue. Her whole mouth burned. She jerked her head back. She spat the liquid out in a violent gasp onto the bedclothes before her. The linen hissed where the drops had fallen. A brown-black mark spread at once upon the white sheet, and in the middle of the mark a dark hole began to open, as though some small fire were eating through the cloth from the wrong side. A sharp, acrid smell rose from the sheet, like the smell of the chemist's shop, of burnt cloth and of sulphur. Mrs. Carnell began to scream. She clutched at her mouth. The nurse stood beside the bed motionless, the cup still in her hand, the pale grey eyes quite steady. For a single moment of pure stillness, the 2 women stared at one another across the ruined sheet. Then the nurse stepped back. The door of the bedroom flew open. Mr. Carnell came in, pale, his coat half-buttoned, demanding to know what was the matter. The servant was behind him, her apron to her mouth. The household pressed in around the bed. The nurse, her face now gone quite white, began at once to speak. It was the chemist's fault, she said. The boy at the shop had made a mistake. He had sold her oil of vitriol by error, instead of the mild remedy she had asked for. She had not known. She had mixed it in good faith. It was a dreadful mischance. It was a dreadful mistake. The story was good enough, in that first terrible hour, to hold. The doctor was sent for in haste. He came within minutes. He examined Mrs. Carnell's mouth. He saw the burns. He saw the sheet. He smelt the acid. He gave the sufferer some milk and some chalk water to drink, to cool the burning. He shook his head. He asked what remedy it was that had been intended. The nurse showed him the brown bottle. He held it up to the lamp. He smelt it. He said the word vitriol. Mrs. Carnell lay back upon the pillows, her lips blistering, the tears running down her face. Mr. Carnell stood in the middle of the room with his hat still in his hand, struck silent. The nurse fled. She left Crawford Street that night. She took her carpet bag. She took whatever small things of her own she had gathered. She slipped away through the back of the house, down the service stairs, out into the dark mews. She found her way across London to another quiet lodging, in another quiet street, where her name and her face were not yet known. She thought, perhaps, that she had got clear of the business. She thought, perhaps, that the story of the chemist's boy would be believed. It was not. Mr. Carnell went to the police. An inspector was sent to the chemist's shop. The boy at the shop was questioned. The apothecary's ledger was examined. The story did not hold. The brown bottle of vitriol had been sold, plainly enough, as oil of vitriol, and the buyer had known quite well what she was asking for. The search began. Notices were set up in the stations of the Metropolitan Force. Men in dark coats and tall hats began to walk the streets asking after a woman of middle height, pale in the face, with grey eyes, a quiet voice, and a small carpet bag. It took some weeks, but at last she was found, lodging under yet another name in a back street on the other side of the river. She was taken into custody. She was placed in a cab between two officers. She was driven through the gaslit streets to the police office, where she was charged with the attempted murder of Mrs. Sarah Carnell. She was not, at first, charged with any murder at all. Only the attempt. Only the draft in the bedroom at Crawford Street. But as the news of her arrest spread across England, and as the newspapers began to print her name, the small quiet deaths of earlier years began to stir in their graves. In Boston, a husband remembered his wife's sudden dying. In Kirkby Lonsdale, a tailor remembered the telegram that had called him down to London. In the streets of Bloomsbury, neighbours remembered the sudden dying of a kind landlady named Soames. And in the office of a certain Mr. Lonsdale at the Home Office, a clerk began to draw up papers one by one, for the exhumation of a row of quiet English graves. Chapter 8. The Widow of West Auckland. While Catherine Wilson sat in her cell at Newgate waiting upon the course of justice, the hills of County Durham were still, for the moment, quiet beneath their heavy grey skies. The coal country of the north in those years was a land of small pit villages set among bare green hills. The smoke of 100 pit chimneys rose in thin grey plumes above the fields. The whistles of the engines blew at dawn and at dusk. The blackened terraces of miners' cottages stretched in long, mean rows, their windows small, their doors low, their yards crowded with coal bunkers and outhouses. Beyond them stood the wheels of the pitheads, turning slowly, lifting men out of the dark and lowering other men back down again. In such a country, in the village of Low Morsley, in the autumn of the year 1832, a child was born. Her name was Mary Ann Robson. Her father Michael was a Methodist collier. He went down the shaft before dawn. He came up again, black as the coal he hewed. He read his Bible by the fire of a night. He sang the hymns at chapel on a Sunday. Her mother Margaret kept the small pit cottage, and bore other children, and stitched their clothes out of whatever cloth can be got. The family moved, as pit families often moved, from one row of blackened houses to another, as the work of the father led them. The child Marianne grew up in such houses. She learned the smell of coal smoke, and of boiled cabbage, and of the wet black earth of the pit yard. She learned, as all children of the coalfields learned, the sound of the steam whistle that sometimes blew at the wrong hour, to say that the shaft had fallen in, and that the men would not be coming up that day. She was 9 years old when such a whistle blew for her own father. Michael Robson fell to his death down the shaft at Merton Pit, in a fall of stones that nobody had foreseen. His body was brought home upon a cart, wrapped in a piece of sacking. The pit owners gave the widow a small sum. The chapel people came with their quiet words. The child Mary Ann stood at the graveside with her mother, and looked down into the hole, and remembered it ever afterward. She was a clever girl. She was devout in the Methodist manner through much of her young life. She taught the smaller children at Sunday school. She sang the hymns in a small, steady voice. She read her Bible. She knew her letters. She was neat in her person. She was quick with her hands. When she was 16, she left home. She went out to service first, as most girls of her village went out to service. She worked for a family in South Hetton, keeping their small house, lighting their fires. Then she turned her hand to another calling. She went into a small hospital in Sunderland to learn something of the trade of nursing. She served upon the wards for a time. She saw the sick come in and go out. She learned the handling of a pulse, the changing of a bandage, the giving of a draught. She did not stay long enough to take any formal paper or testimonial. Such papers for nurses of her kind were not yet given. She went home again to her mother's house when the pull of home grew too strong, and she took up the needle for a time, and made her living as a dressmaker, stitching in the long evenings by the light of a tallow candle. In the year 1852, when she was 19, she married a pitman named William Mowbray. They moved about the country for a time, down into Plymouth, then back up to the northeast, as his work took them. In the years that followed, she bore him child after child. The exact number is not certain. 4, it is thought, and then 5, and then more. Most of them did not live. They died, one after another, of what the doctors of the day wrote down as gastric fever. It was a common enough entry upon the country death certificate in those years. It meant, in plain speech, that the child had been sick to the stomach, had been weak for some days, and had slipped away. It did not mean to the doctors who wrote it that anything criminal had passed. Children died every week, in every village of the coalfields, of sicknesses of the stomach. No one looked further. Mary Ann wept at each small coffin. Mary Ann stood in her black bonnet at each small grave. Mary Ann went home again to the next small rented house and stirred the next pot of tea upon the fire. William Mowbray, her first husband, fell ill in the year 1865. He had, it seemed, some trouble of the bowels. He went slowly. He lay in his bed. His wife sat beside him. She gave him his broth. She gave him his tea. She was kind to him, and patient. He died. The insurance company, which he had lately joined for a small monthly payment, paid out a sum of money to his widow. It was the first of many such sums she would collect. She did not stay a widow long. Within the year she was working again as a nurse at the Sunderland Infirmary upon the fever wards. A patient there, a man named George Ward, took a great liking to the quiet nurse with the black hair and the steady hands. He recovered, at least for a time. He left the hospital. He married her. Within a year, he too was dead. He had relapsed, they said. He had never quite got over the fever. The doctor who had been treating him was surprised. He said so, quietly, to the neighbours. But there was no post-mortem. There was a small insurance payment. It was carried home in a plain envelope to Mary Ann's new lodging. She went next as a housekeeper to a widower named James Robinson, a shipwright in Pallion near Sunderland. He had small children who needed a woman's hand about the house. She came. She brought her own surviving children with her. Death began quite soon to walk again through the doors of the house. One of Robinson's little ones sickened and died. 2 more sickened and died. Then Mary Ann's own daughter, Isabella Jane, the last of the children of her first marriage, sickened and died. Then her own mother, who had come to visit her, sickened and died within a week of her arrival. Each time the doctor wrote gastric fever. Each time a small black-edged notice was cut from a newspaper and put away in a drawer. James Robinson, however, survived her. He survived in great part because he began to notice small things. He noticed the money was missing from his account. He noticed that she'd been taking his insurance papers behind his back. He noticed that she wanted him, rather too insistently, to take out a policy upon his own life. He noticed how many small coffins had gone out of his front door. He turned her out of his house. She went away, with her one living child from him, to drift once more. She drifted to the village of Warbottle, and then to West Auckland, a small mining town in the southern part of the county. There she kept house for a man named Frederick Cotton. He had children of his own. He had lost his wife not long before. He was, like Robinson before him, in need of a quiet woman's hand. She became his wife in September of the year 1870, though she was not in truth free to marry, being still wed to Robinson, who had refused to divorce her. No one in West Auckland seemed to notice. She was his wife, to all outward eyes. She bore him a child. Before long, Frederick Cotton was also dead. The cause given was gastric fever. She took in, shortly afterward, a lodger. His name was Joseph Nattrass. He had been an old sweetheart of hers long before. He had come back into her life. He too sickened. He too died. Another small sum came in from another small insurance paper. She cast her eye now upon a fresh man, one John Quickmanning, an excise officer who had lately been nursed by her through an attack of smallpox. She wished to marry him, but she had about her certain hindrances. She had her own surviving child by Frederick Cotton. She had Frederick's boy of a former marriage, her 7-year-old stepson, Charles Edward Cotton, who lay about the house needing food and clothing and schooling. She spoke of the boy with impatience. She tried to have him taken in at the workhouse. The parish officer, a man named Thomas Riley, listened with some care. He had business with her that day. He had come to ask her if she would nurse another smallpox sufferer in the town. She said she could not. She had the boy to mind. She added in an unguarded moment that it did not greatly matter in any case, for the boy would not trouble her long. He was likely, she said, to go the way of all the rest of the Cotton family. Within days, Charles Edward Cotton was dead. Thomas Riley, the parish officer, remembered what she had said. He went to the local doctor. He went to the police. An inquest was opened. A post-mortem was carried out. The stomach of the small boy was preserved and sent for analysis. It was found to be full of arsenic. The bodies of Joseph Nattrass and 2 of the Cotton children were exhumed out of the churchyard. They too were full of arsenic. In each quiet coffin lay a grain of white evidence that the chemists of the town had long been selling over the counter by the ounce for the killing of rats. Mary Ann Cotton, arsenic widow of West Auckland, was taken into custody in the summer of the year 1872. She was carried to the county jail at Durham. She was placed in a cell. There she was found quite shortly to be with child once more by John Quickmanning, who would never come near the Gaol, and whose name she would never again let fall from her lips. The trial would not be held until the first spring after the child's birth. In the meantime, the pit heads of the north turned on as they had always turned. The smoke rose from the cottage chimneys. The whistles blew. The black rows of houses stood in their long bleak lines. And in 1,000 such houses, in 1,000 such parlours, the kettle sang upon the hob, and the tea was brewed hot and strong, and the women of the coal country sat down quietly at their own small tables, each now looking a little longer than usual at the cup before she raised it to her lips. Chapter 9. The Teapot and the Churchyard. The method of Mary Ann Cotton was so simple a child could have understood it, and so hidden a doctor could hardly have seen it. It rested upon 3 things. The first was the white powder sold at every chemist's shop. The second was the black teapot upon the hob. The third was the practice of the age itself, which asked few questions of any woman seen to weep at a fresh grave. She bought her arsenic openly. She signed when the law later began to require it, under some plain and useful purpose, such as the killing of bedbugs or of mice. In Victorian England, every home had such small vermin in plenty, and no chemist thought it strange to sell a woman half an ounce of white powder for their destruction. The bedbugs in the old pit cottages were a great plague. They lived in the cracks of the wooden bedstead. They came out by night and fed upon the sleepers. A common remedy was to mix a little arsenic with soft soap and paint the mixture into the cracks. The practice was so well known that the phrase for the bedbugs had become a kind of free pass at any counter in the kingdom. Mary Ann Cotton used that phrase. She used it, or others like it, again and again. She carried her small brown packets home in her apron pocket. She kept them, some said, upon a high shelf in her kitchen cupboard. From such a packet she would take only a very little. A pinch at the time was enough, so long as the pinches came often. She mixed it, above all, with the tea. Tea, in the north of England, in those years, was not what the drawing-rooms of London drank from little cups. It was a dark, strong brew, kept hot all day upon the hob, drawn from a fat black pot of cast iron or of enamelled ware. It was poured out again and again into thick white earthenware mugs. It was given, sweetened with brown sugar, to any visitor who set foot across the threshold. It was offered to the sick in bed. It was carried out to the men at the pit in tin cans at dinner time. It was the great universal drink of the working north. Into such a pot once or twice across a long morning A careful hand might drop a small measure of white powder from a paper packet and stir it with the old wooden spoon and set the lid back on, and no eye in the small kitchen would know that the tea was no longer only tea. The sick person, propped upon pillows in the small back bedroom, would drink cup after cup. There would be vomiting. There would be looseness. There would be a terrible thirst. The sick person would cry out for more tea to take away the thirst, and the nurse-wife would bring it, steaming, from the black pot on the hob. The cycle would repeat itself. The arsenic, with each fresh cup, would build up a little more in the organs of the body. On the second day, or the third, or the fifth, the sick person would die. The doctor would come. The doctor would listen to the nurse-wife's story of the cramps and the pains. The doctor would say gastric fever. The doctor would write out his certificate. The doctor would go away. The small coffin would be carried out of the front door. The black-clad widow would walk behind it. The little procession would wind through the pit village to the parish church. The bearers would lower the coffin into the ground. The vicar would read the old words. Dust to dust, he would say, and ashes to ashes. The earth would fall upon the lid. The widow would weep quietly into her handkerchief. The neighbours would say that such a mother had suffered very much. The neighbours would say that it was a hard thing to bury so many of one's own. The neighbours would go home again to their own teapots and pour out their own mugs and think no more about it until the next small coffin came. Behind this public face of grief there stood a quiet counting. Every one of Mary Ann Cotton's victims, where the paper trail can now be read, had some small sum of insurance money attached to their life. The clubs of the North Country in those years were many. A workman, for a small weekly payment of a few pence, could join a burial club. Upon his death, his widow would receive a modest sum, enough to pay for the coffin and the funeral, with perhaps a little over. A man could enroll his children in such clubs too, for a very small fee each. Upon their death, a few pounds would be paid out. It was not a great fortune. It was enough to keep a woman in bread for a few weeks, and in new black clothes besides. Mary Ann Cotton enrolled her husbands, her lovers, her stepchildren, her own children in these clubs. She paid the small weekly sums. She kept the papers safe in a drawer. When the death came, she took the papers to the club's clerk, and signed for her payment, and walked out again with the coins chinking in her purse. There was more. When a husband died, there might be a few pounds of household goods to dispose of. There might be some small savings in a tin box. There might be a watch, or a pair of boots, or a Sunday coat. All these things had a small market value. They could be pawned or sold second-hand or carried on into the next house. Mary Ann Cotton moved often. With every move she became, by small degrees, the sole owner of whatever little wealth the dead had left behind. She did not grow rich. She remained, by any fair measure, a poor woman, but she lived week after week upon the dying of those around her. It is sometimes asked, by those who study her tale from a long distance, how it was possible that so many deaths could occur in the household of one woman without suspicion. The answer lies in the age itself. The pit villages of Durham in the 1850s and 1860s were places where children died in terrible numbers. Some say that out of every 10 children born in such a village, 4 would not live to the age of 5. Gastric fever, diarrhea, scarlet fever, whooping cough, diphtheria, pneumonia were the common names written in the parish registers. In such a climate, the loss of 3 or 4 small children from one household raised no alarm. Neighbours offered their condolences and shook their heads, and said that the Lord had seen fit to take them. To add, on top of this, the deaths of a husband or two, of a lover, of a mother-in-law, was only to repeat the common grief of the age on a slightly larger scale. There was no school of detection. There was no modern toxicology. The chemist shops kept no register of the purchases of white powder. No one thought to ask a nurse-wife why her cooking pot so often preceded a funeral. The one thing that did raise the eyebrow of the parish was her remark to Thomas Riley. It was one thing to lose one's family. It was quite another to speak of it beforehand with dry eyes. Riley went home from that door with her words in his ear. He went to the police. The police listened. Within days, the quiet village of West Auckland had a new visitor, in the shape of the county analyst, a man of chemistry from Newcastle, who carried with him a small black case of test tubes and reagents. He took the stomach of the little boy. He carried it away in a sealed jar. In his laboratory some days later, he poured his reagents upon the mass, and watched the fine brown stain form upon his porcelain dish. It was the Marsh test, the great forensic invention of a generation before. It had come, at last, to West Auckland. It had come, at last, for Mary Ann Cotton. The coffins began to be lifted, one by one, from the small bleak churchyard. Their lids were prized open. The bodies within were examined. Fresh small jars were filled with the dark work of the earth, and sealed and labelled and carried down to the laboratory. One by one, the tests came back. One by one, the verdicts were the same. Arsenic. 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 The quiet cups of tea of many years had left their silent record in the bones and organs of the dead. The dead, at last, had spoken. Chapter 10. The Old Bailey. The trial of Catherine Wilson opened at the Central Criminal Court in the City of London on the 22nd day of September in the year 1862. The court sat in its old dark hall in the Old Bailey, just beside the blackened stones of Newgate Gaol, where the prisoners were housed. The buildings crowded from early morning. Gentlemen in tall hats pressed in at the public door. Ladies of fashion came in dark gowns, some of them carrying small opera glasses, to sit in the reserved seats. Reporters of every London paper filled the long bench set aside for them, their notebooks open upon their knees, their pencils sharpened. In the dock, under the tall canopy of dark oak, stood the prisoner. She was a woman of middle height. She was not handsome, but she was not ill-looking. Her hair was parted plainly in the middle. Her face was pale and round and quiet. She wore a plain black gown. Her hands were clasped before her. She did not weep. She did not tremble. She listened with a small grave attention to every word. The judge was Mr. Justice Byles, a stern and learned man of the common law. The prosecution was led by Mr. Serjeant Ballantyne, one of the most respected advocates of his day. The defence was conducted by a younger man, Mr. Montague Williams, who, though still near the beginning of his long career, would go on to become one of the great names of the Victorian bar. A jury of 12 Londoners sat upon their bench, clerks and tradesmen for the most part, sworn to try the prisoner according to the evidence. She was not, at first, placed in the dock upon a charge of murder. She was tried first upon the charge of administering oil of vitriol to Mrs. Sarah Carnell, with intent to murder. The witnesses came forward. Mr. Carnell described the scene at Crawford Street. The doctor described the burns upon the mouth of his patient. The chemist described the sale of the oil of vitriol across his counter. The servant described the nurse's panic. But Mr. Montague Williams rose for the defence. He argued, with great patience, that it was quite possible that the chemist's boy had indeed made a mistake, and that Mrs. Wilson had not known what lay in the small glass cup. The jury was generous. The jury acquitted her. A great murmur ran through the courtroom when the verdict was read. The prisoner closed her eyes for the smallest instant. She did not smile. Mr. Serjeant Ballantyne, however, rose at once to his feet. He informed the court that there was another charge waiting for the prisoner. It was a charge of the wilful murder of Mrs. Maria Soames of Bloomsbury in the year 1856. The prisoner was not to be released. She was to be taken back to the cells. A fresh trial would begin in a few days' time. That second trial opened on the 25th of September. The same judge sat upon the bench. The same crowd pressed into the gallery. The same small pale woman stood in the dock. This time there was to be no escape by way of the chemist's boy. This time the charge was murder, and the instrument was colticum, and the victim was already 7 years in her grave. The centrepiece of the prosecution was a quiet, elderly gentleman called to the witness stand on the second day. He was Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor, Professor of Medical Jurisprudence at Guy's Hospital. He was, in those years, the chief man of scientific poison in the kingdom. Every case of any importance passed through his hands. He had been called the father of the new English toxicology. He stepped up to the box in a dark coat and a white tie. He spoke in a clear, quiet voice. He described the symptoms that Mrs. Soames had suffered. He described the appearances found, so far as could still be read, from her remains. He described the nature of the tincture of colticum, and the way in which it attacked the lining of the stomach, and the manner in which, after a certain time had passed, its traces faded from the tissues of the dead. He could not, he told the court, honestly stand before them and say that his own chemical tests had found colcopum in Mrs. Soames after so many years in the ground. But he could stand before them and say that the symptoms Mrs. Soames had suffered in life were, in his considered judgment, wholly consistent with colticum poisoning, and wholly inconsistent with the natural gastric disease which had been given as the cause of her death. The defence made what it could of the gap. Mr. Montague Williams argued, with calm ability, that without a chemical proof of poison, no jury could be sure. He pointed to the years that had passed. He pointed to the other possible causes of stomach disease. He pressed upon the jury the old doctrine that it was better for many guilty persons to escape than for one innocent person to hang. He spoke well. He spoke for nearly a whole morning. Then came the witnesses. They were many, and their stories fitted together like the pieces of a dark puzzle. The dead woman's children spoke of their mother's last illness. The doctor who had attended her spoke of his own surprise at the course of the disease. Neighbours spoke of the letter that had been found in the dead woman's supposed hand, which had lately been shown to be a forgery. The handwriting expert spoke of the comparison. A lodger or two spoke of what they had seen upon the stairs. A man of law spoke of the alteration made to the will. Every witness told a small thread of the story. Every small thread, when laid down beside its fellows, made a rope. The rope led back to the pale, quiet woman standing in the dock. Evidence was also offered, or sought to be offered, of the other deaths. Of the captain in Boston. Of Dixon, the heavy drinker. Of Mrs. Jackson. Of Mrs. Atkinson, the milliner of Kirkby Lonsdale. The judge considered. The judge, in the English way, excluded most of it. The prisoner, he ruled, must be tried upon this charge, and upon this charge alone. The jury must not be prejudiced by tales of other deaths, however suspicious. The bulk of those other stories would never be heard from the witness box. The public, however, heard them well enough. Through the columns of the newspapers, in the coffee rooms, upon the omnibuses at every supper table in London. On the last day of the trial, Mr. Justice Byles summed up the case. He spoke for a long time. He was careful. He was exact. He warned the jury of the difficulty of the case, of the absence of direct chemical proof, of the length of time that had passed. And then, at a certain quiet moment, he spoke a sentence that the reporters wrote down in their notebooks, and that the London papers printed in heavy black type the next morning. "Gentlemen," he said to the jury, "if such a state of things as this were allowed to exist, no living person could sit down to a meal in safety." The jury retired. They were not long out. They came back. The foreman rose. They found the prisoner guilty of wilful murder. The judge set his black cap upon his wig. In a slow, low voice he pronounced the sentence of death according to the law. Catherine Wilson, he said, should be taken from the place where she stood, to the place from whence she had come, and thence to a place of lawful execution, and there be hanged by the neck until she was dead. May God, he added, in the old form of the age, have mercy upon her soul. She did not cry out. She did not faint. She turned, upon the word of the warder, and walked back down the narrow stair out of the dock. The gallery sighed. The ladies in dark gowns lowered their opera glasses. The reporters hurried out with their notebooks crammed. The judge rose and went to his robing room. There, in a quiet corner, he sent for Mr. Montague Williams, the young counsel who had defended her so ably. He told him in private words, which were long afterward remembered, that he had done that case remarkably well, but that it had been no use, for the woman at the bar was the greatest criminal that ever lived. Outside in the Old Bailey, the light was fading. The gas jets were being lit along the pavement. The cabs rattled past upon the whetstones. The name Catherine Wilson went out upon the evening papers, in black letters 2 inches tall, into every corner of the kingdom. Chapter 11. Newgate at dawn. The days between the sentence and the hanging were, by ancient English custom, 3 full Sundays. In those 3 weeks Catherine Wilson was held in the condemned cell at Newgate, beside the Old Bailey. The cell was a low stone room. It had a small high window with iron bars. It had a truckle bed. It had a wooden stool. It had a small grate for a fire. It had a heavy studded door with a grille at eye level, through which the turnkey looked in upon her many times in the course of the night. She was not left alone. A pair of wardresses sat with her at all hours, day and night. They sat upon hard chairs near the wall. They watched her with quiet, unsleeping eyes. They spoke little. They had been chosen for the work because they were steady women, of plain temper, who had sat through such watches before. Their duty was simple. They were to see that the prisoner did not lay hands upon herself. They were to note down her words. They were to make certain that, when the morning came, she would be delivered whole to the hangman upon the scaffold. The chaplain of the prison, a Church of England clergyman, came to her each day. He opened his prayer book. He read the offices of the church. He read from the Gospels. He spoke of repentance. He spoke of the mercy of God. He invited her, again and again, in soft and earnest tones, to confess the crimes of her life and to seek peace before the end. She listened. She was polite. She was quiet. She folded her hands in her lap. When he had finished, she thanked him for his trouble. She did not confess. Not to the murder of Maria Soames. Not to the murder of James Dixon, nor of Peter Marwer, nor of Mrs. Jackson, nor of Anne Atkinson. Not to any of them. She maintained to the last that she had done no murder, that the dead had died of their own diseases, that she had only nursed them. A petition was prepared for her. It went to the Home Secretary. It asked for mercy. It was signed by a few. It was answered in the cold form of the age, with a refusal. The law would take its course. On the evening of Sunday the 19th of October, the great bell of St. Sepulchre's Church, across the narrow street from Newgate, began to toll in its old, slow rhythm. It tolled through the long night. It was the duty of that bell to count down, by its slow strokes, the last hours of whoever was to die in the morning outside the prison walls. The streets outside began to fill. Men and women came walking in from every part of London, from the suburbs, from the mean quarters of Whitechapel and of Lambeth, from the quiet lodgings of Bloomsbury and Holborn, to take their places for the morning spectacle. They brought bread in paper. They brought bottles of beer. They brought small children upon their shoulders. They lined themselves along the pavements. They climbed upon the railings. They paid small coins to householders whose windows overlooked the square, to be allowed the use of a good upper casement for the hour of the drop. By 4 o'clock in the morning the crowd was so thick that no cab could force its way through. By 6 o'clock it had been counted in its thousands. 20,000 was the number the papers would give the next day. They stretched from Smithfield in the north down through the Old Bailey to Ludgate Hill in the south. They were quiet at first, and then loud, and then quiet again, in waves, as people do in great crowds. Hawkers moved along the edges, selling sheets of printed ballad, already composed, describing the life and crimes of the woman who was to die, set to the tune of some common melody of the day. A man sold hot pies from a tray. Within the prison, in the grey hour before dawn, Catherine Wilson was roused. She had been allowed a few hours of broken sleep. She rose. The wardresses dressed her. She was given a little tea. She was given a small piece of bread. She was told by the chaplain that the hour was near. She said nothing. She drank the tea. She set the cup down upon the wooden table. She held out her hands, and the strap was placed about her wrists and drawn close and buckled behind her back. She walked, with 2 warders at her elbows, and the chaplain before her reading the office of the burial service, through the long dark corridors of the old prison, out at last through a small side door, and into the cold grey morning air of the yard. The scaffold stood just outside the debtor's door. It was a high platform of black timber, hung with black cloth. A beam ran above it. From the beam dropped a rope, and at the end of the rope hung a noose. The hangman was waiting upon the platform. His name was William Calcraft. He was the public executioner of the kingdom. He had been the hangman of England for near upon 40 years. He was a grim, stooped man in a black coat and a black hat. He was known for a peculiar method of his own. He did not give his condemned the long, sharp drop that broke the neck in a single instant. He gave them only a short fall of 2 or 3 feet, which did not break the neck at all. It strangled them instead. They died, in his method slowly, in the course of a few minutes, kicking and twisting at the end of the line. It was a method that many within the English law considered cruel. Calcraft, however, was the man whose turn it was, and the law at that hour did not reach past him. The crowd beyond the prison wall, seeing her appear upon the platform, raised a great cry that was part shout and part sigh. She did not look at them. She stood quite still while Calcraft came up to her. He pinioned her further. He drew a strap about the folds of her long black gown below the knees, so that her legs would not fly about in the drop. He placed the long white cap over her head. The cap was of coarse linen. It hid her face from the crowd. The crowd groaned softly when the cap came down. He adjusted the rope about her neck. He set the knot behind her left ear. He stepped back. The chaplain read on. In the midst of life we are in death. The bell of St. Sepulchre's tolled again. Calcraft bent down. He drew back the bolt. The trap fell open under her feet. Catherine Wilson dropped a short distance into the space below the scaffold. The rope drew tight. Her body jerked once. A small movement ran through the cloth of her gown. Then she hung still. The crowd gasped. Some were silent. Some cried out. Some laughed in the hard way crowds can laugh at such sights. A reporter in the Press of People wrote down in his notebook that she fell heavily and died apparently without a struggle. Another reporter wrote that the crowd had laughed at the white figure upon the rope because it resembled the poster stuck upon every wall in London advertising a farthing sheet of the life of the late poisoner. A cold wind came down the Old Bailey. The bell tolled on. By custom, her body hung for a full hour. When the hour was up, she was cut down. Her remains were taken back within the walls of Newgate. Later that morning she was buried, without mourners, in a shallow grave in a small paved yard of the prison, beneath a thin layer of quicklime, as was done with all those who died by the law in that place. A letter she was known to have written lay among her effects. She was the last woman to be publicly hanged in London. No woman after her would be made such a spectacle. Within a few years, such executions would be moved within the walls of the prison, and the crowds dispersed, and the spectacle ended. But that lay a little further on. 10 years would pass. Then, in the early spring of the year 1873, the scene was repeated, in another place, upon another woman, by the same hangman, with the same short drop. Mary Ann Cotton had been kept in the county jail at Durham through the long winter of 1872 and 73. She had borne her last child there, a little daughter named Margaret Edith, in the month of January. The child, against all the chances of such a birthplace, lived. She was taken from her mother a short time after weaning. Mary Ann Cotton's trial opened at the Durham Assizes in the first week of March. She was charged with the murder of her stepson, Charles Edward Cotton. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury was out for less than an hour. They returned a verdict of guilty. The judge pronounced the sentence of death. On the morning of the 24th of March, in the year 1873, in the county jail at Durham, Mary Ann Cotton was taken from her cell. She walked as Catherine Wilson had walked, through the long cold corridors of an old stone prison. The scaffold here was set within the prison walls, not outside them. By that year English law had moved the hanging inside. A small party of officials was admitted to witness, with the sheriff, the chaplain, and a few reporters from the northern papers. There was no crowd of 20,000. There was only the grey quiet yard, and the high wall, and the rope upon the beam, and the black-coated figure of the hangman waiting upon the platform. The hangman was William Calcraft again, old now, stooping more than before, but still the man whose turn it was. Mary Ann Cotton walked to the scaffold, praying audibly, the reporters noted, with her eyes raised upward. She did not struggle. She was pinioned in the usual way. The white cap was drawn over her head. The rope was placed about her neck. The bolt was drawn. The trap fell open. She dropped, but the drop was too short. Calcraft, through all his long years, had used always the same short drop, and on that morning it failed. Her neck did not break. She hung there, at the end of the rope, in the grey air of the Durham yard, and she did not die at once. Her body fought below the cap in slow, strangling movements. Minutes passed. The reporters turned their faces aside. The chaplain closed his book. Calcraft, it was afterwards said, was obliged to press down upon her shoulders with his hands, in order that her death might come the sooner. 3 long minutes, by the clock of the prison, passed before she was still. She was buried, like Catherine Wilson, in a quiet plot within the prison walls. 2 women, 2 ropes, 2 short drops, 2 quiet graves, sealed over by the law. Their names passed into the ballads and the broadsheets. Their faces were painted on the walls of the penny papers. In time, the faces faded, and the ballads fell out of use. But the trade they had practised, the quiet trade of the parlour and the sick-room, did not pass away with them. It could not pass away. So long as the small brown bottles stood upon the apothecary's shelf, and the tea waited in the black pot upon the hob, and the trusted nurse walked up the narrow stair of the quiet English house with her small carpet-bag in her steady hand. And so it was that those who read of the 2 deaths in the newspapers of England began at last, in the quiet of their own parlours, to look across at their own hearths and to think. Chapter 12. Ashes in the Parlour. A great quiet fear in the middle years of the old Queen's reign crept from parlour to parlour across the English land. The papers had given it a name. They called it the Poison Panic. It had been growing for some years. The Rugeley murders of Dr. William Palmer had fed it in 1856. The trial of Dr. Smethurst had fed it again at the end of the decade. The arrest of Catherine Wilson had given it a new shape in 1862. The discovery of Mary Ann Cotton 10 years later had lent it a still darker colour. In between, 100 smaller cases had come and gone through the assize courts of the kingdom, of husbands poisoning wives, and wives poisoning husbands, and children poisoning parents, and servants poisoning masters, and nurses poisoning patients. The panic was not pure invention. It rested upon real ground. It rested, above all, upon the shelves of the apothecaries. Parliament had begun to stir in the 1850s. A first small law had been passed in the year 1851, which had placed the slightest of restrictions upon the sale of arsenic. That law had required the purchaser to sign a book, and had required that the powder be mixed with soot or indigo so as not to be mistaken for flour. But the law had many holes in it. A signature meant little, for the name given was seldom the true name. The colouring was sometimes left out. The chemists of small towns were often lax in their record-keeping. The law, at best, had been a half-measure. In the years that followed, committees sat. Reports were drawn up. Speeches were made in both Houses of Parliament. At last, in the year 1868, a greater Act was passed, which bore the plain name of the Pharmacy Act. Under the Pharmacy Act, a list of poisons was drawn up. Arsenic was on it. Colchicum was on it. Prussic acid, oxalic acid, strychnine, opium, belladonna, all were on it. From that date onward, only a person qualified and registered as a chemist and druggist could sell such substances at retail. Every sale of a listed poison was to be recorded in a book. The book was to contain the name and address of the purchaser, the purpose of the sale, the date, and the quantity. The book was to be open to inspection. A chemist who sold a listed poison to a person not known to him without due inquiry was to be liable to penalty. The small bottles upon the shelves did not vanish. They stood there yet, but the shelf at last had been put a little behind a counter, and the book had been set down upon the counter, and the quiet hand that had reached so easily across it in the days of Catherine Wilson and Mary Ann Cotton now had to set a name and a purpose down in ink for anyone who came later to read. Other slow changes through those years were at work. The nursing of the sick was, in the quarter century after Miss Nightingale's return from the Crimea, reshaped by careful hands. Schools for nurses were founded at the great hospitals. St. Thomas's in London opened its training school in the year 1860. Others followed. A nurse within a generation would need a proper paper signed by a matron to prove that she had served her time. Her name would be written upon a register. She could no longer walk into a strange house with no letter but the word of a neighbour. The age of the self-appointed sick nurse, the quiet woman at the door with the small carpet bag and the unchecked name, was, slowly, drawing to its close. The age, too, of the public hanging was ending. The spectacle that had drawn 20,000 souls to watch Catherine Wilson die was not long repeated. In the year 1868, within a few months of the Pharmacy Act, another Act of Parliament moved all executions inside the walls of the prison, out of the public eye. The sellers of broadsheet ballads lost their trade. The hawkers with their trays of hot pies found another living. The crowds drifted away. The old scaffold outside the debtor's door at Newgate was taken down. The stones were scrubbed. The Old Bailey's trials went on, but the hanging itself now took place behind a high grey wall, in a small quiet yard, before only a few witnesses. The age of spectacle was folded up, like an old black cloak, and laid away in a drawer. In the private parlours of England, slow changes crept as well. The fear of the nurse, and the fear of the cook, and the fear of the poison caddy left a mark upon the habits of the age. In more than one careful household, it became a point to keep the tea caddy locked and to carry the key upon the chatelaine at the mistress's waist. It became a point, among some, to ask for a character in writing before engaging a servant. It became a point, here and there, to note down the names of those who brought medicines to the door. Mothers and grandmothers warned their daughters, in the way that mothers of every age have warned their daughters, never to drink anything whose making they had not seen. Still the Victorian parlour kept its shape. The heavy curtains hung at the windows. The china dog sat upon the mantel. The photograph of the lately departed stood in its silver frame, draped with a small black ribbon. The family Bible lay upon the little round table, opened at a favourite page. The clock ticked on. The parlour was still the heart of the house. It was still where the living sat on an evening, and where the dead were laid before they went out by the front door to the grave. Catherine Wilson and Mary Ann Cotton passed into history as two figures out of that parlour's darker shadow. Their names were joined in the long accounting of the age with others, with Sarah Chesham of Essex, called Sally Arsenic, hanged before them, with Amelia Dyer of Reading, the baby farmer who would come after them, with many smaller names forgotten now, who had carried in their aprons the small brown packets that had undone whole families. They were not one woman. They were a pattern. The pattern was made by the age itself. The world that had bred them slowly passed. The gas lamps gave way in time to a new yellow light that did not hiss. The horses gave way in time to other things. The fog that had hung over London for 100 winters began, in another century, to thin out at last. The little bottles were taken down. The Great Pharmacy Act was added to, again and again, by newer laws, until the small brown packet could no longer be had at any country chemist's shop without the paper to show for it. The Marsh test, which had first brought James Marsh such trouble in a country courtroom in 1832, was joined in time by other tests, more exact, by means of which the dead could speak more clearly from their graves than they had ever spoken before. The trusted nurse, uncertified and unquestioned, faded into memory. Only the parlours, here and there, remained. In the old streets of Boston in Lincolnshire, the small brick house by the quay still stood. In the old streets of Bloomsbury, the tall, narrow house in Alfred Street still stood, its windows looking down upon the plane trees in the square. In West Auckland, the blackened terraces still stood, their yards still cluttered with coal bunkers and outhouses. In Kirkby Lonsdale, the old church stood above the town, and the dressmaker's grave lay quiet among its grey stones. In each of those houses, through many long years after, some new family set out the tea things upon the little round table, and poured the kettle, and sat down in the firelight, and spoke of small matters, and heard the wind in the chimney, and did not know, or did not think to know, of the older story that had once been played out, between those same four walls, in the days when the gas lamps had burned low, and the doors had been shut tight against the fog, and the kind nurse had softly, "Drink it down, love. It will warm you." The listener, wherever the listener lies now, is safe. The lamps have been lowered. The door has been made fast against the night. No stranger stands at the bedside. No small brown bottle waits upon the shelf above. The old stories are only stories now, and the hands that did those deeds have been still for 100 years and more. The candle burned low. The chamber fell silent, and history once again turned the page in the dark.